Could the Rangers really do the unthinkable and buy out Jacob Trouba after a rough showing from the Ranger captain? We discuss.
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1087 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. And it's time to address the elephant in the room here on Locked On New York Rangers and talk about a topic that, it's certainly not a subject that hasn't been covered by, various beat reporters or other podcasters or, fan chatter as well. And that is the idea, the possibility of the Rangers potentially buying out Jacob Trouba from the final 2 years, of his contract. Now, I think first and foremost, it's important to understand what that would entail. If the Rangers were to buy out Jacob Trouba, they would essentially be paying money to him for the next 4 years to come. He's only under contract for 2 more seasons at $8 million a pop. He does have now a limited no move clause, and we'll address that a little bit later in today's episode. But if the Rangers were to buy him out right here and right now, Trouba would then cost $4 million against the salary cap for each of the next 2 seasons. And then for the 2 seasons after that, he would count $2 million against the salary cap. So that's what it would entail. That's what the story would be if the Rangers were indeed to do that. And we're going to give Trouba a fair trial here. We're going to look at it from both sides. And I'm going to have a verdict at the end, my final thoughts on what I would do if I was the Ranger GM. But for right now, let's look at the case for buying out Jacob Trouba from the final 2 years of his contract. I think first and foremost, exhibits A, B, and C would basically all be this latest playoff run that the Rangers had. They make it to the Eastern Conference Final. They get within 2 wins of going to the Stanley Cup Final. And of course, it does not happen. The Panthers win. And Jacob Trouba was he was a disaster for the Rangers in this series. I said this on a recent episode. I think it was actually the episode when we were discussing right after Game 6 and the Rangers have been eliminated, trying to go over everything that went wrong. I went in on Trouba like I don't think I ever have for any single Ranger player. I'll call out the team from time to time on here, but I've never really gone all in on a player the way I did there because he was absolutely just not good enough. I mean, his play was unacceptable for somebody making half as much as he makes, a quarter as much as he makes, and I think it really hurt the Rangers. Not to get too deep into the specifics, but a couple of examples, the Game 4 overtime play, Rangers are shorthanded. He all of a sudden just rushes Tkachuk, who's along the boards, takes himself completely out of the play, and the Panthers score the game winner. Game 6, end of the first period, still scoreless. He, for some reason, at the blue line, decides to try to check Evan Rodriguez, who did not have the puck, completely whiffed on him. The Panthers execute a give and go, and they score. The turnovers were out of control. The penalties were completely out of control. 11 minor penalties in the playoffs by Trouba. And the 12 combined games that the Rangers played against the Canes and the Panthers in the playoffs, we'll take the Capitals out of the equation here. The two, fellow heavyweights, the Canes and the Panthers, Jacob Trouba in those 12 games took 10 penalties. I don't even know how that's possible, but facts are facts. That's what happened. The other, case that I could make against Jacob Trouba, as far as him sticking around, the case that I would make for, potentially buying him out is the Rangers are going to need cap space. Paying Jacob Trouba $4 million to not play hockey for the Rangers, at first glance, that seems a little steep to, how much of a cap hit do you want for somebody to not play hockey for you? And I get there being some reservations there among certain Ranger fans, but that does free up a cool $4 million for the Rangers to use it wherever they need it. We know that Igor Shesterkin is going to need a contract extension, assuming the Rangers want to keep him. I mean, you never know what can happen. Does Igor have that idea in his head that maybe he could go somewhere else? I've seen some people float the idea that maybe he sees what happened to Henrik Lundqvist and he doesn't want to have it happen to him, and maybe he would, field other offers. That's a question that only Igor Shesterkin can answer. But the bottom line, if we assume that the Rangers want to keep him here and we think that Igor himself wants to, remain a New York Ranger for the foreseeable future, it's going to be expensive. And I think the toughest season to fit Igor Shesterkin under the salary cap will be the one after this upcoming season, because at that time you've still got Panarin under contract making $11.6 million, or whatever it is. Jacob Trouba is still there making $8 million. That's a lot of money, and that's going to be a tough situation to navigate. If you buy out Jacob Trouba, then there's only a cap hit of $4 million, from Jacob Trouba going into that offseason. That gives you an extra $4 million to work with, and Igor Shesterkin in that situation might be able to fit, under the salary cap just fine. Alexis Lafreniere, he's also going to need an extension at that time. Now, another option here, what you could do if you're the Rangers, you could let Trouba play this next year of the contract and then buy him out next offseason. I realize that, but the bottom line, they're trying to win a championship right now. The championship window is open, and they want to make it happen, and it might be more cost effective to pay Jacob Trouba $4 million to not play hockey for you than it is to pay $8 million for him to do so. But they could do anything this year. If they buy him out this year, they could have an extra $4 million in cap space. You can find maybe his replacement, another defenseman, as far as just a UFA signing. You could try to trade for somebody, whatever it might be. But that $4 million does obviously create a little bit more flexibility. Another thing that kind of popped into my head, putting this episode together and listing all the reasons and trying to be as fair and balanced as I possibly can here. Another thing that you could say, as far as, being in favor of buying out Jacob Trouba, K'Andre Miller is a better player when he's not with Jacob Trouba. I don't think that anybody that watched this Ranger team this season can really argue against that at this point. Now, there's times in the past where the Trouba-Miller pairing has done well together. This season, that was not the case at all. And I think it's pretty undeniable right now that K'Andre Miller is a better player when he's on the ice with Braden Schneider than he is when he's on the ice with Jacob Trouba. And look, Miller's not blameless either. At best, he had an up-and-down playoff run for the Rangers this year. The Ranger defensemen in general really struggled against that Panther forecheck in the conference final there. And we'll talk about Miller and everybody else, in due time here. But right now, the focus is on Jacob Trouba. And I just feel like, you look at K'Andre Miller, and he kind of burst onto the scene for the Rangers, and he's already, a solid defenseman very early in his NHL tenure. And I do think there's been more ups and downs with Miller over the years here. But I also feel like it's an indictment on Jacob Trouba that K'Andre Miller's game seems to fall apart when he's on the ice with Trouba. And when he's on the ice with a fellow, young player, a player that's even younger than Miller in Braden Schneider, that's when he seems to be at his best. And I can't completely pinpoint the reasons why, that Trouba-Miller pairing was so shaky this year, but facts are facts. I mean, we all saw it with our eyes, and those two tended to struggle when they were together. You can say what you want right now, and a lot of people already have said what they wanted against about the Rangers star players. Panarin and Kreider and Mika. You can say what you want about players like that, but when Artemi Panarin is on the ice, he's a great example to use here. He elevates whichever line mates he's out there with. Obviously, Trocheck and Lafreniere this year. Panarin's found a way to make it work with guys like Dryden Hunt and Phil DiGiuseppe. He obviously got the most out of Ryan Strome that anybody was ever going to get out of Ryan Strome. So Panarin elevates guys, and you can't say the same for Jacob Trouba right now. And those are supposed to be, the veteran leaders and the guys wearing the letters on their sweater. Panarin, could he have done better in the playoffs? Yes. But he does elevate players. And you saw what, Trocheck and Lafreniere were able to do in the playoffs on Panarin's line. With Jacob Trouba, whoever's out there with him, you're already kind of fighting an uphill battle. And I think that was on display for a lot of this season, and certainly in the playoffs as well. And, the other thing I got to point out here, if we do go, like say we go into next season and Jacob Trouba is still here, there's a very distinct possibility that the Rangers might go with Miller and Schneider together. I'd in fact be in favor of that, even if Jacob Trouba is back next year. So now Jacob Trouba becomes a bottom pair defenseman, and that's exactly what he is as far as his productivity when he's on the ice and just how good you feel about him being on the ice in a big spot. Jacob Trouba at this point, when you look at the Ranger depth chart, he is a third pair defenseman because Adam Fox, Ryan Lindgren, K'Andre Miller, Braden Schneider, they're all better than him. It's really that simple. And here's a question that I have for everybody. How many bottom pair defensemen in this league do you know of that are getting $8 million a season? Because that's what it would be for Jacob Trouba going into next year if they line up the way that they should line up. And I'm not sure they will. They'd probably at the start of the season have Miller and Trouba back together and have Trouba in the top four as a way to, I guess, a vote of confidence in the captain and also to sort of save face. But if you have Trouba on the bottom pair, which is where he would belong next season if he's still a member of the Rangers, he's making $8 million a season. You look at the other Ranger defensemen that were kind of in and out of the lineup this year, the guys that kind of one time or another, maybe they had to step in due to an injury or whatever the case may have been. The other guys that were filling out the bottom pair and playing the number 6 or number 5 defenseman role, you look at those players, You have a combination of Eric Gustafson, who was making $825,000 this past season. Chad Ruedel was at $800K. Zach Jones was at $812K. Braden Schneider, he was on his ELC, but still finishing up his $925K per season. Those are the other 4 players that we saw with any kind of regularity at all. And I mean, Ruedel only played 5 games, but with any kind of regularity at all that were on that bottom pair for the Rangers, they're all making 6 figures. Jacob Trouba is at $8 million. He's almost at 7 figures. So you look at that, and I just don't know how you can justify having a declining and just frankly not very good lately defenseman on the third pairing making $8 million a year. I just don't think that's very cost effective. You could argue it's not cost effective to pay him $4 million to not play for the Rangers, but at the same time, you do free up a lot of money, and that's money that could be spent in other places. So that's kind of the case for buying out Jacob Trouba. In just a second, we're going to shift our attention a little bit here. I'm going to, at least for the time being, go to bat for the Ranger captain. We'll at least, like I said, give him a fair trial, take a look at some of the good things that he does, and some of the reasons why maybe the Rangers wouldn't want to do that. So, yes, we will do that in just a second. All right, we just want to go ahead. Thank everybody, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. And we definitely would like to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is, of course, brought to you by Policygenius. A lot of life is unpredictable, but a good life insurance plan gives your family a financial safety net to protect against some of the unknowns. Policygenius is the country's leading online insurance marketplace. It makes choosing the right policy for your family easy and quick. With Policygenius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options are 100% online and let you avoid unnecessary medical exams. Policygenius helps you easily compare your options from America's top insurers in just a few clicks. Their award-winning agents can even walk you through the process step by step. Get peace of mind by finding the right life insurance with Policygenius. Head to policygenius.com or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That is policygenius.com. All right, once again, big shout out to the everydayers. Thank you guys, as always, for supporting the Locked On New York Ranger podcast. And you're definitely going to want to stick around. We've got draft talk coming up. The Locked On NHL hosts have recently done a mock draft. I got to pick number 30 as the de facto Ranger GM and made my pick there. I'll keep it a secret for now. We'll eventually reveal it. We'll look at some options that the Rangers can maybe go with at number 30, depending on who's available at that time and who's not. Also, going to continue to talk about New York Ranger free agents. We talked about Capo Caco in our last episode. Check that out if you missed it. And I think next, I'm thinking we'll turn our attention to Braden Schneider. I think he's another, obviously, big-name free agent. He's an RFA. I think the Rangers would do well to lock him up, and we'll get to that likely in our next episode. But for right now, let's look at the case against a buyout of Jacob Trouba. First and foremost, you are buying out your captain. We've talked before how this is a really tight-knit bunch, or certainly it seems to be that way among Ranger players in that locker room. And that's a blow to the leadership group for sure. And whatever you might say about Jacob Trouba, we know the guy's tough as nails, and he has been a part of a lot of winning there, a couple of deep playoff runs now, and he is one of the guys that has been there through this transformation of Ranger culture. Watching this team go from rebuilding and, obviously struggling to put the pieces together for a couple of years to, now a bona fide Stanley Cup contender. And there's going to be people that have things to say about that. When you're in the Eastern Conference Final and you're 2 wins away from the Stanley Cup, you are a bona fide Stanley Cup contender. Think about Game 4 going into overtime. Now, the Rangers were badly outplayed in that game, but if they won their 3rd straight overtime game to go up 3-1 in the series, you can't tell me that it would be impossible for the Rangers to make it to the finals. And at that point, it's certainly not impossible, to beat the Edmonton Oilers. They're a great team too, and who knows what would have happened, but nobody can convince me that, it's impossible. And one of the players responsible for molding this team into a winner is the captain, Jacob Trouba. The captain, look, when things are good, they're going to get praise. When things are not so good, the heat's going to come down on them a little bit. But one thing I don't think you can take away from him is he is kind of a lead by example kind of guy. And again, somebody that's been part of this new Ranger core and has turned this team around, has turned them from a cellar dweller to a team that every year is certainly a threat by the time playoffs roll around, and a couple of Eastern Conference Final appearances as well. And the one thing I'll say about, anybody who might be concerned about that, and I have my own concerns too about buying out the captain, but this is not uncharted territory for the New York Rangers. They traded McDonough, who was a captain. They traded Callahan, who was a captain. Callahan and the Rangers just could not agree on a contract extension, and they really had no choice. They flipped him for Marty St. Louis at the trade deadline. And, Chris Drury, he's the Ranger GM now. He was once the Ranger captain, and how did his tenure end? Well, he got bought out by the New York Rangers. The final year of his contract, he was bought out. Obviously, Henrik Lundqvist was never the captain, but he was the guy. I mean, he was the face of Ranger hockey for a decade plus, and they bought him out of his contract. So it's not like this is unheard of. It's not like a captain can't be traded or bought out or whatever the case might be. And it's not uncharted territory. It's probably not something that's a lot of fun for a front office to do, but it comes with the territory, and you have to make smart business decisions. And for me, if you were to buy out Jacob Trouba, it's nothing personal. I don't have any ill will against the guy. He's incredibly charitable away from the rink, and that's awesome. More power to him. But it would just be, from my point of view, a business decision if that's what the Rangers end up doing. Something else here that kind of goes hand in hand with what we just talked about. Again, the leadership void. I don't know what you do at that point. I don't know if that would, if Trouba gets bought out, if that's something that would affect the locker room in a bad way. I mean, on one hand, you just got to get over it and be a professional, keep playing hockey. But who steps up into that leadership role? Who steps up as the new captain? When you look at guys like Chris Kreider and Mika Zibanejad, I just don't think it's going to happen for them at this point. I don't think it would happen. They'd almost be kind of like a lame duck captain, because when the Rangers chose Trouba as their new captain, it was really three players. We talked about every possibility and what they could do, but really the next Ranger captain at that point was either going to be Trouba or Mika or Kreider. At this point, I think the ship has sailed on Mika and Kreider, and I just think there's better choices, if I'm being completely honest. And I think those better choices, it starts with Vincent Trocheck. We saw what a great teammate he was through this entire playoff run here, and how well he did in the playoffs, and how much he's just giving everything he's got on every shift. Lafreniere, if you want to go with a little bit of a youth movement, I mean, there's certainly been captains that are younger than him. That's always an option. And I think maybe Barclay Goodrow, if he's going to stick around into next season, then, he'd be a good choice too, the grizzled veteran there. But bottom line, there could be a leadership void if you buy him out. One other thing that I'll throw out there too is, a little bit of a fear factor and an intimidation factor. We've talked about how, a lot of fans really, really want the Rangers to get bigger, more physical, tougher. I do think, generally speaking, that the Rangers are underrated in terms of physicality and in terms of toughness, both physical and mental toughness. But I will say they were clearly coming up on the short end of the stick when it came to physicality against the Florida Panthers. That's kind of Florida's MO. And, at times that was clearly to the Rangers' detriment. Again, I don't think the Rangers are like this soft team. There's people that'll throw that out there. I mean, a stat that I go back to pretty often is the regular season, 7th in the league in hits. That doesn't sound like a team that is getting pushed around out there. They've got a lot of guys that'll fight if the occasion calls for it. They were in the top third of teams in the NHL in terms of most fights for the season. So this is not a team that goes out there and gets pushed all over the ice. That said, I do think Florida had the physicality edge. And I think probably anybody that watched that series would likely agree with me on that. So that being the case, do you really want to get rid of one of your most physical players, one of your most intimidating players, one of the players that kind of strikes fear into the hearts of their opponents? And this is one of those things that's tough to measure. We get all these old school stats, and we've got some new school metrics as well. There's nothing really there that can tell you, like, how much is Jacob Trouba messing with his opponents? How many players on the other team are kind of, head on a swivel when they know they're on the ice with Jacob Trouba? How many guys are afraid to, go into the corner when Jacob Trouba is out there with them? How many guys are afraid to try to get to the front of the net when Jacob Trouba is in front of them? We don't know that for sure. I mean, I don't think it's like every player in the NHL, but there might be some players that are a little bit undersized that don't want any part of that. And that's one of those things that, again, is difficult to measure. And on top of that, you look at the other Ranger defensemen, I don't think too many of them really, I mean, the Rangers have good defensemen. They struggled against the Panthers, but overall, I do like the Ranger blue liner group. However, there aren't really anybody, there's not really any defenseman there for the Rangers that's really going to strike fear into the hearts of the opponents the way that Trouba can. Maybe Braden Schneider a little bit. They did call him, what was his nickname? I think it was like Baby Trouba or something like that. Lindgren plays a hard-nosed style, but he's not the biggest guy out there, certainly not the biggest defenseman out there. Adam Fox, Keandre Miller, I mean, they'll hit from time to time, but that's not really their MO. And I mean, Zach Jones, he's undersized and known as a little bit more of an offensive defenseman. So Trouba's that dude. He's that guy that can obviously hit and throw his weight around and, again, possibly intimidate the opponent, at least to a certain extent. And the other point, and I've kind of made this a little bit earlier, but I'll emphasize it here because this is the portion of the episode where we're defending Trouba. Is it really worth it to pay Jacob Trouba $4 million per season to not play for you, is that the better option than paying Jacob Trouba an extra $4 million and a total of $8 million to play hockey for your team? I don't know. I think in some ways it honestly could be, but you could make the case that that's just not worth it. You're going to pay him $4 million anyway, and there is enough to like about Jacob Trouba, whether we're talking about leadership or physicality, shot blocking ability, whatever it might be. That maybe it's more worth it to just hang on to him for the price that he's at than to buy him out for half of that. The other thing here, too, is kind of an X factor, and I don't think you can let this be the reason why you don't buy out Jacob Trouba, but it's worth mentioning here. If you were to buy out Jacob Trouba, you've got no control of where he goes and which team he signs with. I don't know about you guys. I don't really want to see Jacob Trouba on the Islanders or the Devils next season. That's not going to be good. I don't think he would get $8 million a year. In fact, I know he would not. But he could end up with one of those teams and maybe looking for revenge against the Rangers, and that's not ideal. And again, that can't be the biggest reason why you don't do it, but it's not nothing either, so worth at least throwing that out there. All right, we're going to keep everything rolling in just a second. Going to come up with a verdict here, what I would do if I was the Ranger GM. Would I buy him out? Would I give him another chance next season? We will get to that in just a second. All right, let's go keep everything rolling here. I want to get to the verdict and discuss whether the Rangers would actually do this. If it's up to me, if I'm wearing my GM hat, which I'm going to do for the next 10 minutes or so here, I think I'm doing this. I think I'm buying out Jacob Trouba. As I mentioned, I really went in on Trouba during the first episode after the season was over. And in 1,000+ episodes of doing this podcast, I don't think I've ever really, gone after a single Ranger player the way I did then. And as I mentioned before, there were times, where maybe I would call out the team a little bit for a lackluster performance or a lackluster handful of games, whatever the situation might be. But Jacob Trouba, his play was indefensible in the playoffs this year. And the other thing here that I have to mention, as far as, why I would do this, why I would buy out Jacob Trouba, there's no other way out of this contract. I really don't think there is. I feel like he, being paid $8 million a season is basically untradeable. Now, it is worth noting that his full no move clause has either already become a partial no move clause or it is about to. I don't know what the exact date is there, but the bottom line is it is happening in this offseason, and his full no move clause becomes a modified no move clause where he can only block a trade to 15 teams. And for the record, next year, if we get to next year, Jacob Trouba is still on this team. At that point, he would only be able to block a trade to 12 teams. But I'm not even sure that matters because I just don't know how many teams are lining up to acquire him and take on that contract. It's not like he couldn't have value to one team or another. It's just when you look at that price, it's like, man, that is a lot. Maybe you can get fancy here. I've heard that Utah, they don't have a name yet, but the Utah hockey team, the former Arizona Coyotes, they might be looking to add a couple of veterans and a couple of names, get people interested in the team. And you bring in a hard-hitting player like Jacob Trouba, that gives your team some edge, and maybe some fans would be into that, and they would go see him. But I don't think you're going to do that without either attaching a sweetener. And I've seen people say things like, oh, yeah, attach like one of the Ranger prospects. I'm not doing that either. I'd rather buy him out than give away a prospect just for somebody to take Jacob Trouba off of the Rangers' hands. But yeah, I mean, maybe you can send him to Arizona and essentially get nothing back. I mean, maybe you get like a 7th-round draft pick in return for him, and maybe you hang on to like $2 million of the of the $8 million that Jacob Trouba has owned. You retain 25% of the salary. There's ways to maybe do this and maybe make it happen. I don't even know for sure if Utah would be on Jacob Trouba's no move list or not. Have no way of knowing. That information is not public, but it's possible. A Trouba trade is possible, but I look at that contract and I'm thinking, man, who is going to line up right now after seeing what he did in the playoffs, the way that he played, and be like, yep, $8 million for that guy. That's what we want. Even if the Rangers essentially give him away for free, I don't think that anybody's taking on that contract. And another reason here why I'm buying him out, this is just kind of my own little personal thing as a podcast host, so take this with a grain of salt. But just to inject a little bit of humor here, I am sick and tired of every 3 episodes having to come on here and discuss Jacob Trouba's latest questionable moment, his latest borderline dirty, was it clean hit that he's thrown on somebody. I understand hockey is still a game of intimidation and it's still a game of imposing your will on somebody. I get all that, but I'm just tired of having to either defend this guy or call him out or, look at some other hit that happened around the league. Like, well, that guy got suspended 4 games for that. So maybe it should only be 2 games for Jacob Trouba. Or that guy didn't get suspended at all, so Jacob Trouba shouldn't have to get suspended either. I mean, look, there's times where he creams somebody out there and it is a clean hit. And there's times where, other fan bases will go after him and you watch the replay and it's like, nope, that's shoulder to chest. That's clean all the way. But there are times where this guy very clearly crosses the line. He got suspended for play this year. And there's times where, he's really laid people out. He gets that elbow out. There's times where he's had the elbow up and missed. Who was he trying to hit? I think it was against the Canes in overtime in that one game where he basically just missiled himself into the boards and his arms were up for that. Now that one, and again, this is what I'm tired of talking about, but you could make the argument there, well, his arms were up because the boards were there and, he's trying to protect himself. Fine. But there have also been some moments that he's had out there that are pretty indefensible and suspension worthy. And in the case of this past season, he did get suspended. I want to say it was just 2 games, but he had to watch from the press box after his latest questionable hit. And I'm just tired. I'm over it, man. You can be a physical, hard-hitting player out there without, crossing the line over and over and over again. I mentioned Braden Schneider not too long ago. I think he's a great example. A couple of years ago, he's playing for Canada in the World Juniors, and he had a hit that was to somebody's head, and he ended up 5-minute major out of the game, and I think suspended for 1 or 2 games after that. I'm not sure what it was, but he is course corrected since then. Braden Schneider will still go out there and hit very hard, but he hasn't done anything since he's been on the Rangers that looks to me at least like it's crossing the line. There is a way you can do that and still intimidate and still have that physical presence without, giving people concussions. So look, I don't take any joy in this. I'm just wearing my GM hat right now. I don't have anything against Jacob Trouba personally. As I mentioned in the past, he has had some good moments here as the Rangers, but I just look at him and this guy's making $8 million a year. Like, are you kidding me? You couldn't find anything better to do with $8 million than sign Jacob Trouba from now until the end of time. I mean, it was a 7-year deal. He's now in the final 2 years of it, but Trouba's been here for, longer than you might realize, if you initially look at it. And it was a tough decision for me to make, whether to buy him out or not. Just putting this podcast episode together, and I'm not even doing it for real. This is like a mock GM session. Chris Drury is the Ranger GM, and hey, I'm sure he's paid very handsomely for that, and it's a prestigious position and everything, but he's the guy that now has to make this decision. And there's other people that can weigh in. There's other members of the front office, but ultimately, he's the GM. He's in charge of the roster. This all falls on him. It's one man's decision at the end of the day, and it's going to be up to Chris Drury. For me, though, you look at a situation here where the Rangers are. They are in a championship window. They are paying $8 million a season to Jacob Trouba, and I think that money being spent on Jacob Trouba is hurting this team's chances of lifting the Stanley Cup more than it is helping this team's chances of lifting the Stanley Cup. So for me, I'm doing it, and I'm doing it with an eye on the near future and the long future as well. You have Igor and you have Lafreniere next season. Igor's a UFA, Lafreniere's an RFA. You could even throw K-Andre Miller in there too. He's an RFA, and those guys are going to need new contracts. I like the idea of clearing the books. And this year, if you buy him out, that's an extra $4 million of money that you can use to go out there and target, a free agent or two that maybe put this team over the top, that maybe give the Rangers what they need. Maybe you bring in, a big-time, hard-hitting right winger, a guy that can do some of the dirty work, and you put him with Mika and Kreider. If buying out Jacob Trouba opens the door for the Rangers to do that, then I can't possibly say no. And as far as the Ranger defensemen are concerned, if Jacob Trouba's out of the picture, well, Zach Jones now gets his chance, doesn't he? He's probably going to get his chance next year anyway, because I don't think Gustafsson is going to be back. So I think you'll see Jones slide into the lineup as a 6th defenseman. But if you buy out Trouba, then Jones is definitely going to get a chance. We'll see how he does. And then maybe you just kind of go cheap for your 6th defenseman. Maybe you bring back Chad Ruhwedel on a 1-year deal for like $850K or something along those lines. And maybe that's your third pairing. You go with the veteran Ruhwedel, the young guy Jones, and that could go either way. That could be a weakness for the Rangers, but if things aren't going well, then you go out there and you make a deal at the trade deadline or near the trade deadline. You bring in a defenseman that, you can afford, which presumably you will better be able to, because Jacob Trouba, there will still be the $4 million cap hit after the buyout, but you won't be paying $8 million to Jacob Trouba. So that would open up the door for something like that as well. Now, do I think the Rangers are going to do this? Do I think that they're actually going to sit down, have this tough conversation, and figure out a way to buy out Jacob Trouba? I got to be honest, I don't see them doing it. I don't think they'll pull the trigger on a move like this. I think they do value his leadership. I think they do value his physicality, his willingness to block shots, and all those things are valid, positives of Jacob Trouba and his game. I will say this, though. I'm not one of those Ranger fans that's going to root against my own players just so I can be right about something. Right now, my stance is I think Jacob Trouba should be bought out of his contract. My other stance is that I don't think the Rangers will do it. But you have these Ranger fans, and we know all about them, but they have their favorites, and then they have players they don't like, and it borders on being uncomfortable with how much certain Ranger fans seem to hate certain players on this team. Like, it seems really personal. And I feel like those fans, if you can even call them that, are rooting against players that they don't like just so they can be right about something. And I've never understood that. Don't you want to see the Rangers win? Don't you want to see a Stanley Cup? It's been one cup in 84 years. Don't you want to see these guys do well? And with all that said, let me bring this right back around to Jacob Trouba. If he is back next season, if the Rangers decide, nope, we're not buying him out, we're not going to trade him either, he's going to be here, he's going to be our captain, he's going to lead us into the next season and hopefully to the Stanley Cup, I will be the biggest Jacob Trouba fan you've ever seen. I don't know how well it's going to go, and I don't think he's going to ever live up to being worth $8 million a season, but am I going to root for Jacob Trouba to go out there and do his thing and have the best season that he's ever had in his NHL career? You better believe it, because I want to see the Rangers lift the Stanley Cup. Again, the price tag is the thing that I keep going back to. I just cannot see him next season or the one after that, where you look at Jacob Trouba and think, $8 million, yeah, money well spent. I just don't see that happening. But I would love to be wrong about that. Nobody would be more happy to be wrong about that than myself. So we'll leave everything there for today. You guys can weigh in, buy out Jacob Trouba, give him one more year, try to trade him. If you trade him, then obviously you don't have to worry about his cap hit anymore, unless there's some salary retention, which there could be. But maybe that's an idea. You trade him to one of the teams that would take him on, if there is any team, and a team that's not on his no-move list, which there are 15. So we'll see. It's going to be very interesting to see what the rumors are and if the Rangers actually do this or not. Figure we could pretty much call it there for today, though. Another big call for the mailbag. We're going to do a mailbag episode in the not too distant future. A couple other things we want to run through and give you guys some time to send in your questions. You can do it via audio, or you can just send me an email. And no real guidelines, just anything you're burning on, anything you feel like the Rangers need to do this offseason, somebody they should trade, somebody they should target in free agency, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, we will call it there. Once again, if you guys would like to get in touch with this podcast, especially for the mailbag, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, at @LO_NY_Rangers. Once again, that's at @LO_NY_Rangers. And definitely subscribe to the Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.